Hi, everyone. Welcome to Marxist 21's international panel discussion. We'll just give everyone a few more minutes to log in and make sure that we're all set and ready to go. Talk to you soon. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Marxist 21's inaugural international panel discussion, Capitalism in Crisis, Coronavirus, Climate Change, and the Socialist Response. My name is Rebecca Gilson, and I'll be your chair today. I'm a member of the Marxist 21 and the Southern California branch. We are very excited to have two amazing speakers who have been extremely influential in framing our understanding of the current environmental and economic crisis of capitalism and the importance of a radical socialist response. Mike Davis is a prolific writer, environmental historian, and author of Ecology of Fear and The Monster at Our Door. Joseph Choonara is the author of Unravelling Capitalism, a guide to Marxist political economy, a columnist for the magazine Socialist Review, an editorial board member of the International Socialism Journal, and a member of the British Socialist Workers' Party. And a little bit about us. Marxist 21 is a network of revolutionary socialists across the United States. We stand in the tradition of socialism from below, the idea that workers can only emancipate ourselves through our own struggles. The structure of today's meeting will consist of presentations from each speaker, around 15 minutes, followed by two audience questions, which the speakers will then have 10 minutes to respond to, and then another round of two questions with 10 minutes to respond. So if you're interested in asking a question, please send that along in the Facebook chat with your name and your location if you're comfortable with sharing that information. All right, so without further delay, let's begin. Joseph, would you mind starting us off?
Yes, thanks a lot. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Fantastic. Well, I think I want to start by saying thank you for inviting me, and it's wonderful to be speaking alongside Mike here today. It's a really important meeting because I think what you see at the moment is a sort of triple crisis of capitalism. And I want to explain what I mean by a triple crisis. First of all, most immediately, we have the impact of COVID-19, disease caused by this novel coronavirus itself. And that's something that we're all very familiar with. The US now has the greatest number of cases. Britain has the second greatest death toll in the world. What's been posed in this crisis very, very sharply for me is a choice between defending profits and saving lives. And once you begin to see it in these terms, you can begin to understand why the measures taken to try to contain this, this pandemic disease have been so little, so late in many cases. And why, when they do finally take desperate measures and lock down societies and so on, there's this huge pressure to reverse those measures extremely quickly. And what you find here is not simply that there's a capitalist dynamic shaping the response to a crisis, but it shapes who gets hit by the crisis. Overwhelmingly, it's the poorest, it's the most oppressed groups in society who are suffering the most. It's very noticeable in Europe that over half the deaths have come in care homes, a sector that has been starved of resources in recent years and decades. Disproportionately, Black and minority ethnic people are being hit. They're twice as likely to die in Britain. There was some speculation in the press this was some sort of genetic predisposition, but in reality, it's just that Black people, Asian people like myself, are far more likely to work in frontline services. I find it much more difficult to self-isolate because of their housing conditions, and are more likely to be poor. If you look at the working class as a whole, working people find it far more difficult to self-isolate than those in slightly better paid conditions. This is just in the global north. If we look at the global south, which this pandemic is now beginning to envelop, the impact could be even more catastrophic. If you think back to the history of the 1918 flu pandemic, which killed 50 to 100 million people, something like a third of those deaths were concentrated in India, where you had the impact of malnutrition, but also of grain requisitioning in the context of the end of the First World War, and fractured and damaged health systems. Now, those kind of conditions have been reproduced over vast swathes of the global south by the impact of structural adjustment, the widening gap between rich and poor that's been taking place in recent years. And so the impact there will, I suspect, be absolutely catastrophic in the months and years to come. That's the first element of the crisis. The second element is the economic crisis, which it is incredibly deep because it's simultaneously hitting both production and demand for goods. It's a very, very unusual crisis we're seeing. And already it's clear the impact is something like 3 or 4 times greater than the beginning of the Great Recession of 2008. It's comparable, I think, in scale to the 1929 crash and what followed. Certainly, if you look at unemployment in countries like America and elsewhere, it's having a huge impact. For us in Britain, our records go back a little bit further, and we now know that this is the sharpest recession in Britain since 1706. It's the worst crisis in 3 centuries, we're told by the Bank of England. And then thirdly, we have a deeper crisis, which is the broader ecological crisis that underpins all this, with the threat of catastrophic climate change and so on. And we should remember how the year started, not so much with the pandemic, but with fires raging in Australia, the Brazilian rainforest on fire, huge floods in Indonesia, and so on. So already we have this backdrop of catastrophe, this almost apocalyptic seeming beginning to the world. Suddenly we're hit by the impact of this coronavirus. Now, I think to understand this crisis, we can do much worse than starting with this idea that's become very popular in recent years, popularized by people like John Bunby Foster and Ian Angus and others, of a metabolic rift created by capitalist production. And this idea, which really goes back to Marx's writing, is the idea that as humans emerge as a society, you have this complex metabolism of human society interacting with this equally complex natural metabolism. And the way in which capitalism, because of this rapacious desire to extract profits, to accumulate capital, and so on, disturbs this balance between society and nature, and tends to both render, commodify nature, but also to despoil the natural environment. And we see lots of instances of this. To give one that was particularly striking to me, the beginnings of the pandemic and the economic crisis associated with it marked a point at which the Saudi government and the Russian government decided to embark upon a vicious price war over the price of oil, partly fought out, certainly on the part of the Russians, to try to destroy the US shale oil and gas industry. Completely preposterous in many ways at this time when demand for oil was collapsing anyway, but creating a situation that is so absurd that at one point the big oil corporations were paying people to take oil away from them, I'm told. Now, the dysfunctionality of capitalism is at no point in this situation is the question posed of why are we extracting this oil from the ground anyway? These questions simply don't enter into consideration. All we have is this brutal dynamic of competitive profit-making and accumulation playing out between these global oil corporations, fused together with these different states. And this is the dynamic that we're up against. I think it's very important to say, as Mike has argued and other people, Rob Wallace is another key reference point in this argument, that this metabolic rift also underpins the emergence of these novel viral threats. I won't labour the point about the development of big agribusiness because Mike has written far more eloquently than I could about the growth of chicken and swine farming in North America and Europe, and now as a global phenomena. But this has created absolutely ideal conditions for viruses such as influenza and now coronaviruses to spread among flocks of chickens, herds of swine, and so on, and to begin to cross over into human populations. But alongside this sort of big agribusiness, which forms this kind of petri dish for viral threats, you have the impact of these systems of production on fragile natural environments, pushing into former wilderness areas, commodifying bits of nature, and drawing animal species into contact with one another. And you see this happening in all kinds of ways. If you look at West Africa, part of the reason the Ebola pandemic developed was to do with palm oil plantations being created largely under the auspices of big Western multinationals that created these oil plantations, pushed bats out of their natural environment into the palm oil plantations, brought them into contact with humans, and allowed the Ebola virus to spread from bat populations to human populations. Again, this is another example of the fragile ecology being disturbed by these flows of capital into these conditions, creating the possibilities for the spread of viruses from animal populations to human populations. So we have to understand the way that this crisis is bound together. Turning to say a little bit more about the economic catastrophe that's unfolding. I think it's very important to say that even before the impact of coronavirus, the capitalist economy was in an extraordinarily fragile situation. And it's important to say that because if you look at the graphs produced by the IMF, the World Bank, and everyone else, they show a sharp recession and then an equally sharp rebound coming towards the end of the year as the virus is brought under control. I think this is wildly optimistic in terms of the likelihood of a recovery coming. You look at the roots of the economic crisis, it's very important to understand that the global capitalism, as Anwar Sheikh and Robert Brenner and Michael Roberts and myself have pointed out, global capitalism has been plagued by low profitability for several decades now. The crisis really began to develop at the end of the 1970s, but the capitalist economy was pushed forwards by a whole series of bubbles in the economy and underpinning them, what I call a sort of mega bubble of credit, which drove the system onwards. And every time this system of capitalist development has come under threat in the last 20 or 30 years, the ruling classes have responded by creating an even bigger bubble. So in 2001, there was an economic crisis. In the US, the Federal Reserve cuts interest rates and creates an even bigger housing bubble. In 2007, 2008, this bubble comes crashing down again. And again, what you see is cuts to interest rates, credit expansion, quantitative easing, and so on, to push the economy onwards. In doing so, creating an ever more bloated financial system underpinned by an ever greater mountain of credit. What this does is it systematically destabilizes the capitalist system, but it also perpetuates this problem of profitability. Economists have begun talking about a sort of mountain of zombie firms who are able to service their debt or simply accumulate more debt under these conditions, but really aren't engaging in large-scale investment or really anything very much profitable. And it makes the system extraordinarily fragile. It makes the likelihood of this being a prolonged slump, which shapes politics for many, many years and decades to come, very, very likely. And this is why we're seeing such dramatic measures undertaken by states. Having reached the limits of this process of credit expansion and quantitative easing, more and more they're turning to direct intervention in the economy. A couple of examples. If you look at here in Britain, we have a furlough scheme where the state will pick up the tab for 80% of workers' wages. I estimate that if you combine public sector employment, people dependent on welfare directly, and people who are completely dependent on this furlough scheme for their income, you're talking about roughly 40% of the workforce in Britain now who are recipients of direct state support in one form or another. If you look at America, other countries, you see these huge stimulus packages. The estimate now, the most recent estimates, is that the stimulus will amount to something like $10 trillion. They're debating now in the US expanding that. This is equivalent to something like 8 Marshall Plans. This is a huge state intervention in the economy. And it brings me to the last couple of points I want to make. We shouldn't mistake this state intervention with some sort of shift towards a socialist economy of any kind. What I think we're seeing is really socialism for the bosses, capitalism for the workers. I mean that in 2 senses. First of all, huge corporate welfare in these bailouts for the bosses, but it seems that in state after state, we're now seeing a reversal of the containment policies, the lockdowns and so on. This is, I mean, America only got so far into a lockdown, but if you look at Europe, where there are much more major lockdowns, Spain, Italy, France, Germany, Britain are all debating how to come out of lockdown now. And doing so in the face of quite widespread opposition from the public, from the unions and so on. But what they're risking is unleashing a second wave of the pandemic under these conditions. But it's not just this. We have to think about what the world is going to look like once they begin easing these restrictions. I read endless comment pieces in the press saying that there's no going back to how we were before, and that's true, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be better than it was before. It can be a lot worse as well. Think about what they did after the great economic crisis of 2008, when we were told we had to suffer a decade or more of austerity to claw back the money that had been spent. When you think about the scale of the state support, we have to worry about the impact of this. And in conclusion, I think what we have to say is that this triple crisis, the coronavirus, the economic crisis, and the deeper ecological crisis, is intensifying all the tensions and contradictions of capitalism. At an international level, it's making the system ever more chaotic and competitive between different states and different areas of the system, reinforced, of course, by the collapse of any sort of American aspiration to global leadership in this period. But it's also creating the conditions of intensifying class antagonism as well, between the minority of people who control capital and the now 1.8 billion people who labor under the system. And it's very easy to forget in this current period that if we look back at last year, it was a year of enormous revival in major class rebellions in Lebanon, in Chile, in Ecuador, in Hong Kong, in Puerto Rico, in a whole series of countries, and in the case of Sudan and Algeria, big revolutionary explosions that took place. All of this driven by the deep discontent that people already felt with the state of economics, with the state of the ecological catastrophe, and with the burning inequality at a global scale. And I think under these conditions, what we have to say is that though there's no automatic resumption of these kind of struggles, we have to look to ways of building serious resistance. In the case of Britain, what this means at the moment is resisting the pressure to reopen the workplaces, trying to shift the frontier of control so that the question of when you reopen the workplace doesn't rest solely in the hands of the government and the people running these workplaces. That's going to take serious strike activity. If you look at many countries, the cutting edge of this is the schools, because they've realized they can't reopen workplaces unless the schools are taking care of kids. In France, the unions there have now promised in the schools, if you try to reopen, we will take strike action. There's a fantastic poster which says, our children are not lab rats. In Britain, the teaching unions as well are saying, we're going to resist this. We have to turn that into reality. But I think within those broader struggles that are going to take place, we have to try to win a militant minority at the very least to the idea there's something systemically wrong with the whole system, and the idea of some kind of revolutionary transformation that can lead to a sustainable democratic alternative, what we like to call socialism. And I think that kind of transformation is not simply a possibility in the current world. More and more it begins to seem like a necessity. So I'll finish there and hand over to Mike.
Thanks so much for that, those insights, Joseph. Mike, would you like to give a brief introduction?
Sure. So one night in mid-March, we all went to bed. And then we woke up in the morning, we looked outside the window, and it was 1933 again. Or to follow Joseph, if you were in the UK, you went to bed and woke up in the morning and looked outside, it was 1706. I want to go back to what now seems almost a lifetime ago, to the fall of last year. And last fall, the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization, the FAO, and the United Nations Food Project issued an extraordinary warning. It predicted that in 2020, several hundred million people around the world were facing the possibility of famine. It predicted starvation on a scale that had not been seen since 1944, 1945. And this urgent warning, which the AFO has endlessly repeated, of course, found no listeners in Whitehall. It found no listeners in the White House. But we must understand that this is what's coming this summer and this fall, an unprecedented crisis of people's food security, the possibility of mass starvation. Go back last fall, read the business press, read the academic economics journals. They're all talking about recession, not if a recession, but when a recession. If you look a little more deeply into this literature, you find specific discussions about, for instance, China. In 2009, China played a major role in pulling the capitalist world system out of a deep crisis by a huge stimulus package, part of which became eventually the Silk Roads project. And unprecedented scale in history. And this particularly brought East Asian capitalism back to life, but for countries in Europe like West Germany, whose major market for their exports is now China, to whom they sell machine tools and other capital goods. This was a lifeline. But if you're reading last fall, you'll see all kinds of articles saying, well, China can't do that again. China has leveraged itself to such an extent that it would be impossible for it to carry out a second stimulus. And China's slowing down. China faces probably the largest of all the debt bubbles that Joseph was talking about. Go back to late fall, go back to actually beginning of fall, go back to September, and Trump's Council of Economic Advisors issues a report on the risk of a pandemic. This report repeats warnings that have been given out continuously since the US adopted a national strategic plan for influenza pandemic back in 2005, responding to bird flu and to SARS. And annually, there have been high-level reports and meetings, not only in the United States, but through the World Health Organization and in West Germany and France, Japan, and the United Kingdom, similar reports. But what the Council of Economic Advisors found, not only was that the threat, as everyone agreed, was imminent, but they specifically focused on the question of vaccine and antiviral development, and carefully explained in terms that might be the only common ground I can think of between Marxist economists and members of the corporate business community, that big pharma was incapable of producing the lifeline vaccines and medicines necessary within the time period that was essential to save millions of human lives. I find this quite incredible. So last fall was a season of warnings and predictions, all of which have now come true. And I think we need to think about this not just as the pandemic plus a recession, but the beginning of a new historical epoch in which capitalism's increasing failure to ensure human survival, and indeed its threat to human survival, will become visible on four different fronts, which are coalescing together right now into a single complex crisis. First of all, globalized capitalism cannot guarantee food security or sustainable water for the world. The United Nations has warned for years, as have all the food nonprofits and researchers, that we need to increase world grain production by 50% to guarantee food security for population by mid-century. That's not happening. And here in this predicted famine year, now Russia has stopped exports of wheat. Russia is the largest wheat exporter in the world. The pandemic is already exacerbating what was a critical food crisis. The Green Revolution that occurred in the late 50s, early 60s. When we think about the Green Revolution in agriculture, we usually think about sensational hybrids, super corns, and things like that. At the base of the Green Revolution were tube wells, drilling millions and millions of wells, for instance, in Punjab, Rajasthan, but all over the world. Those wells are mining water from aquifers that are becoming depleted at an increasing rate. One cannot stress how dangerous the question of food security is. Secondly, capitalism can't decarbonize the economy, or of equal importance, can it adapt countries, particularly the countries who will be most devastatingly affected by global warming, but did the least to contribute to the greenhouse gases, to adapt them to survive the changing climate, and above all, its threat to infrastructure. Thirdly, it's been clear for 20 years that capitalism is no longer on a global scale a jobs machine. Okay, in Africa and Latin America, the majority of the workforces in cities on those two continents are toiling in subsistence sector, the so-called informal economy. It's an euphemism for structural unemployment. People who get by sewing at home, pulling rickshaws, scouring through garbage heaps, working part-time in construction. And now we're seeing an estimate in the paper today in the New York Times that 42% of the jobs lost, the 33 or 35 million jobs lost in the last 5 months, will be lost forever. Trump may claim that the breakup of world trade will lead to the repatriation of jobs from East Asia. But if in fact capital pulls out, US capital pulls out and repatriates production, it will be to automated factories. Those jobs are not coming back. And the whole Trump era has been a cargo cult without any basis in reality. And finally, the most hopeful thing is the revolution in biotechnology, genetic design, state-of-the-art genetic sequencing, vaccine development, and so on. But as we see right now, the large pharmaceutical monopolies, who more than anything are rentiers. They no longer research and develop new drugs. They may buy out small companies that have done that. They spend their money on advertising and huge legal political efforts to defend their patents. They're more like vampires than drug developers. We see what's happening in the private hospital and medical sector in this company. The insurance industry is profiting right now because so few people are able to go in for operations or other medical procedures apart from coronavirus. So a lot of private hospitals are collapsing, and the prediction is, if you read Fortune or Business Week, that private equity and hedge funds will step in and buy that all. Even more profound privatization and disconnection of the health sector from actually providing health. So the fourth contradiction, it seems to me, is that despite the revolution that's occurring, and right now, for instance, biotechnology and genetic design is comparably on what it was 5 years ago. But the private sector and market is incapable of translating that into public health for all. And above all, incapable of ensuring that any of the benefits of that delivered to the poor countries of the world. So if I were to sum all this up in a classical Marxist phrase, it's simply that capitalism in its existing financialized form is become an absolute fetter on the development of the productive forces necessary to human survival over the next decade and beyond in the 21st century.
Thank you both for that really insightful and startling analysis of the current situation. I think we all have probably a lot of questions and things to think about now. We'll move on to the question section of the discussion. So I'll ask 2 questions now, and then we'll give each speaker 10 minutes to respond. We'll start with Mike this time, if that's okay with you, and then move on to Joseph. So the first question comes from Faylene in Toronto. They write, "It seems that in both the US and Britain, the ruling class is desperate to get the economy going again, which seems to mean forcing workers to go back to work. In Trump's case, because he's desperate about winning re-election in November, but also in both cases because of the pressure from big business and CEOs to get their profits flowing again. Can you speak to how ordinary workers are reacting to this in both countries, being asked to put their lives on the line again for capitalism?" So the first question is about how workers are reacting. And then the second question comes from Chris in San Diego. They write, "Can you talk more about climate change? Many of the proposals on the table seem both difficult to achieve in the system and insufficient to address the problem. How do we put revolutionary politics on the table to address the climate crisis?" So Mike, if you don't mind, would you begin answering those? I'll give you 10 minutes.
Okay. In the first place, if you read the newspaper, watch TV, all the conversation is about the dysfunctionality or the incompetence of government in London and Washington, D.C. But there's more to it than that. I would have thought from just reading the paper that Boris Johnson waited a month or 5 weeks to take action just because he was distracted and incompetent. Now we know, and Joseph can speak more about this, that in fact he was following a secret plan that his government had adopted based on advice from a group of scientists whose names had never been revealed in public. And as his own Eminence Greece said, what we want is to keep the economy going, get herd immunity, and if a lot of pensioners die, so be it. That was also been the thinking in a less organized way within the Trump administration, where you have the Republican Party's king of fools, Devin Patrick, the lieutenant governor of Texas, saying, well, I'm old, but I'm ready to sacrifice my life to get the economy going again. He, of course, isn't going to sacrifice anything, but people's grandmothers and grandfathers will, and they've died like flies in nursing homes here in the rest of the world. But I think what we're seeing very clearly and unequivocally in the United States is the beginning of a new labor rebellion, a grassroots labor rebellion that's growing week after week as people refuse to accept that they should be sacrificed in order to grease the wheels of profit, demanding personal protection, refusing to go back to work if it means a risk to life itself. But we've seen everywhere amongst grocery workers, warehouse workers, Amazon employees, and of course, above all, in the health sector, something like a spontaneous strike wave, the likes of which we haven't seen since the early 1970s. And also because of the fact that the ground has already been plowed for a new set of progressive demands by the Sanders campaign that correspond particularly to the material situation of young people, both high school graduates and college graduates who have no foothold in the economy anymore. And of course, that group of people, together with workers of color, will face the greatest blunt of unemployment, which now threatens to stretch on for years. In terms of climate change and socialism, again, climate change, jobs, food security, and health are really aspects of it, of a single crisis. And we have to begin to rethink our approach to global warming and to understand how important the issue of adaptation is. We're talking about the need for trillions of dollars of spending in public works throughout the world. But this crisis, this complex crisis, means that socialist demands, or rather what Trotsky called transitional demands, reforms that have an anti-capitalist logic, reforms that make sense, that ordinary people feel are necessary and urgent, but challenge the logic of the system itself. These kinds of socialist demands now have mass audience beyond anything we could have expected. So on one hand, is we must continue the fight for universal health care. We should take up what Elizabeth Warren has proposed in this country, which is the public production of lifeline medicines and prescriptions. Get rid of big pharma. It's not necessary. We've come to realize that Amazon, and by the way, the pandemic has made Jeff Bezos $25 billion richer since early March. Amazon's a public utility. I propose in the nation that we should start with an excess profits tax, as was used during the two world wars of the last century. But now we need to go beyond that. We must talk about, as old-fashioned socialists did, of telephone and power and water utilities 100 years ago. We must talk about the public ownership of the digital infrastructure of society. I mean, these kinds of demands don't openly say demand a workers' government or a socialist society, but they're obviously profound demands that challenge the logic of the system and also correspond to this new historical period. Its dangers, but also its enormous possibilities for struggle.
Thanks, Mike, for that. Joseph, 10 minutes to respond. Would you like me to summarize the questions again, or?
That's okay. I think I got them.
Great.
Yeah. First of all, on Mike's point about Britain, I mean, there is this capitalist dynamic that you see playing out everywhere, where the first response to this pandemic is, first of all, to try to keep the circuit of capital flowing, try to keep profit making going, and so on. And then you get this turn often to quite authoritarian top-down versions of the lockdown, essentially to try and preserve the economy in the face of the pandemic when it gets out of hand. And then you get this turn to try to reopen the economy. And you've seen that almost everywhere in one form or another. In Britain, it took this very peculiar form in which, as Mike says, they begin with complete complacency. For many weeks, the only advice was wash your hands more frequently while singing Happy Birthday, or I think one of the Tories ministers said we had to sing the national anthem whilst we were doing it, and nothing else. And then this extraordinary thing leaked out about the concept of herd immunity. In other words, what they were expecting was for 60–70% of the population to contract COVID-19 and then to develop some sort of societal immunity without any kind of vaccination or anything like that you'd normally use as part of a herd immunity strategy. It was only when it was pointed out to them that this would mean at least 250,000 deaths in Britain, but probably many more than that, because we've already seen here the way that the effective the onslaught on the National Health Service, the sort of filling up of intensive care beds and so on, have impacted all sorts of people with other underlying diseases, that they realise that really you're talking about 500,000 deaths potential, that kind of figure, that they change their approach. And occasionally a little bit of the thinking sort of slips out into the mainstream. I'll quote from a journalist in the Daily Telegraph, which is a major sort of right-wing daily newspaper. This is Jeremy Warner. He writes, from an entirely disinterested economic perspective, the COVID-19 might even prove beneficial in the long term by disproportionately culling elderly dependents. And it's the kind of thing that you assume they always talk about at dinner parties, but then you find out this is actually what they're saying, this is actually how they think about us. Now, of course, this means that when they enacted the lockdown, it had quite a lot of support broadly in society, and that's quite important to understand. It's slightly different in other bits of Europe. If you look at France and Italy, I would say that the lockdown was driven really by a massive wave of either actual strike activity or the threats of strike activity. And there are elements of that in Britain as well. A comrade of mine in South London led, I think, 8 or 9 libraries out on strike. They just walked out because they said, it's not safe to work here. In the universities where I work, we'd already had quite a long grinding strike for many weeks. I think if they tried to get us into the lecture theatres to keep teaching, we would have walked out, but they shut down the universities instead. So there is this kind of sense of this potential bubbling away for serious workers' action. You see it in lots of different ways. There's endless struggles over what used to be called the frontier of control in the workplace. So drivers on the buses who cordon off the front seats on the buses to try to stop passengers sitting there to try and protect themselves, but then they're told by their bosses they're not allowed to do that, and it becomes a point of confrontation. You see similar sorts of things in the supermarkets, you see it in the health service, and you're seeing it everywhere where people are forced to work. What's going to happen now? I think there's going to be a huge battle in the coming weeks in Britain, particularly to reopen the schools. It turns out that the schools are not just about educating or indoctrinating or whatever our children, they're also essentially free childcare for millions and millions of working class people, and they can't reopen big sectors of the economy without the schools reopening. So this has become a really, really major confrontation in France and in Britain, and it will be in other countries as well. And there may well be walkouts over this. I think we have to try to find ways of developing these kind of struggles. We're not seeing, I think, yet in Britain anything like what you've seen in recent months in America in terms of the revival of industrial militancy from below. But I think it's very important that we try to promote these kind of struggles that are taking place. And as I say, elsewhere in Europe, they'll be more intense. On climate change, just very briefly, because I agree really with what Mike is saying, very important to realize that there was a huge rebellion developing over this before this all broke out. The school kids walked out in Britain were on an absolutely huge scale, not just in Britain, but many other countries. We have this organisation, Extinction Rebellion, that essentially shut down vast swathes of London for several days, twice last year. These are big movements that are taking place. What I think we have to do within this is argue strategically for the kind of thing Mike's talking about, the sort of a set of transitional demands that point in an anti-capitalist direction and link where people are at now to where we want to go. At the same time as that, I think the basic sort of propaganda argument that the left puts, that really fundamentally capitalism has failed the planet here, that capitalism is destroying us in all the ways that Mike and other people are talking about. This argument remains absolutely fundamental, and we have to, within the context of participating in those broader movements, I think, point our finger at capitalism and say there is a system behind this that fundamentally has to be overthrown if we're going to actually find our way out of this crisis.
All right, thank you for those great answers. We'll move on to the second round of questions. So the first question in this round comes from Claire in Los Angeles. They ask, how do you see this crisis exacerbating imperial tensions, particularly between the US and China? And the second question for this round comes from Giannis in New York. They ask, can you talk about the reopen protests, the so-called reopen protests, and how the far right is trying to use this to mobilize itself? We are sure to see attempts by the fascists and the far right to use the crisis by whipping up racism. What should we be on the lookout for? Is it time for a revival of the United Front strategy? So thank you for those questions. This time, Joseph, would you like to start? Again, you'll have 10 minutes.
Yeah, probably won't take 10 minutes on this, but I mean, look, there's a very, very sharp and growing series of tensions on a global scale. I think that what I call the sort of triple crisis is going to intensify all those tensions and contradictions. If you look at the history of economic crises and crises generally, as the crisis intensifies, you tend to get intensified conflict between different imperialist powers as they try and fight over who bears the greater costs for the crisis. And that's taking a very intense form. And of course, in the backdrop to this, you have the long decline of American power reinforced by the disasters in Afghanistan and Iraq and so on. And you have this very unstable period where no other global superpower is able or prepared to step into the shoes of the US and play this kind of hegemonic role on an international scale. So I'm sure you're going to see an intensification of these tensions, particularly between the US and China. As I say, I don't think that means automatically that China is going to replace America as a global superpower, but you are beginning to see it begin to try to assert itself using different forms, often of soft power as well as hard power, in its own backyard and in certain regions of the world and so on. And the Belt and Road Initiative that Mike mentioned is part of that strategy. So I think we're seeing a new period of inter-imperialist tension, of rivalry and conflict. And you see that in lots of other contexts as well. I mentioned the kind of oil war that's taking place involving Russia, the Saudis, the US and so on. It's another sign of the instability of the system and the incapacity of America as the traditional kind of hegemonic power to contain all these kind of conflicts. So I think that's going to be a feature of the period. In terms of the reopen protests, I mean, obviously, we're not seeing it in the same sort of way in Britain. We've not had sort of that kind of mass protests demanding the reopening of the end of the lockdown and so on so far, but we're seeing racism come to the fore in all kinds of ways. I mentioned the way that the lockdown is being implemented in quite an authoritarian top-down way. My partner lives down in South London. It's in Brixton. It's the centre of the Black community in London. And there you're getting lots of little bits of tension developing because the police are, of course, stopping and searching people. Who do they stop and search? They stop and search people from Black and minority ethnic backgrounds and working class people generally, but they're the kind of people that they seem to focus on. So there's all kinds of tensions that come out. And of course, you have the background of anti-Chinese racism, which, historically, I wouldn't say has been a major form of racism in Britain. It's always been there. But in the last few months, we've seen lots of attacks as huge numbers of Chinese students in particular in British cities all over the place who have come under physical and verbal attack. And it's really important that we respond to that and we defend those people. Is it a time for the return to the United Front? I mean, in Britain, fortunately, we have lots of experience of building broad united fronts, working with different kinds of socialists, different kind of anti-racist groups, different sections of the Black community and so on, to build broad anti-racist movements that confront and try and drive back racism. I'm pleased to say my own organisation, Socialist Workers' Party, has been at the centre of that, and Stand Up to Racism is the latest version of that, but it has a long history going back to the Anti-Nazi League of the 1980s and so on, and before that. But yes, I think this is something we have to guard against, and it's very noticeable in the American context. You get it in the press here as well. All the talk about the Wuhan disease, the Chinese disease, the Chinese virus, and so on, which seems to me a very clear attempt to direct the anger and antagonism in a nationalistic and racist way. And we shouldn't forget that the wave of sort of radical nationalists and racists which emerged before this crisis broke hasn't gone away. Look at Bolsonaro in Brazil, but also look at Hungary, where you have this vicious anti-Semitic racist government in which the leader of the country has essentially assumed dictatorial powers and is ruling by decree. And so it's clear that sections of the right are going to try and use this crisis. So we need to be prepared to respond.
All right, thank you, Joseph. Mike, 10 minutes to respond.
Well, first of all, the anti-quarantine protests are a rerun of a show that we're all familiar with. It was called The Tea Party, and it publicized itself as a grassroots rebellion against Obama, but it was anything but that. Its key organizer was a far-right nonprofit called Freedom Works, and it was, of course, funded by billionaires. This time around, it's the same group of people. Freedom Works is at the center of many of these protests. One of the chief financiers of a new front group for the anti-quarantine protest is Robert Mercer. He's a hedge fund billionaire. He and his daughter, Rebecca, were Ted Cruz's leading supporters, as well as the patrons of Breitbart and also of Cambridge Analytica, the notorious PR firm. And they shifted support and eventually got the religious right to shift support to Trump. So they play an enormously important role. And here's Mercer, once again. I think what's remarkable about these protests is how few actual working people are at these protests. They're white. They all look like either country club types or, typical white nationalists driving huge SUVs. It's really important that we're not distracted by them, or for that matter, not distracted by Trump as the root of all evil. In state after state, big city after big city, where the majority of people dying from this are Latino, Black, Pacific Islanders. What have the Democrats done? I mean, even in Chicago, which is an African-American mayor, this has come very late in the day, the recognition of the disproportionate burden of death because of the nature of people's jobs, as Joseph said, but also because of pre-existing health conditions, where there's been any targeted response to that. In other words, we should hold everybody in power's feet to the fire. We should understand that Governor Cuomo of New York, who's emerged supposedly as the hero of all this, has been an assassin of healthcare. Proposed last year big cuts in healthcare in this, the state of New York. It's a bit like in the 1960s, where the movement was always under attack by the police. So I ended up focusing far too much on the police and not on the actual rulers of the country, not on the actual, power structures. And this is where we need to be directing protests. And I must say that perhaps the most criminal thing of all, it's been the lack of a specifically targeted response to the nursing home assisted care industry, which in this country is, of course, almost entirely private. And back in March, I think it was actually early March, I circulated a letter from a friend of mine, Jim Straub, a union organizer who represented the Kirkland, Washington nursing home where the outbreak began. And he said, look, public health people come in here, they don't even bother to interview the workers. They haven't said a word so far by the lack of protective equipment. They don't understand people who are working for $10 an hour, or I think it's now 13 in Washington, have to work 2 jobs. A lot of the people here moonlight in other restaurants. That's why almost a dozen other nursing facilities were infected in a few weeks. Now it's spread across the country, and we're seeing death tolls of 50, 75, in one case, even 100 people in nursing homes. And of course, there should have been a targeted response. This is an industry dominated by chains, which in turn are owned by private equity companies or limited partnership of people who are basically gangsters, who find it cheaper to pay fines for abuses within the nursing homes than correct it, where there's no infectious training, where there isn't equipment. So nursing homes have been turned into a mortuary. And of course, federal government hasn't done anything about it, but states should and cities should. This is again where accountability has to be across the board. And by the way, one study shows that about half the people who died in Europe from coronavirus had died in elderly care facilities of one kind or another. And I believe about, Joseph, correct me, 40% in the UK. Just very quickly, we need to take the new Cold War with China very seriously. And it's not just Steve Bannon. It's not just Trump's inner circle. It's not just a campaign strategy. Biden has bought into this. He says he'll be tougher on China than Trump is. They're in a bidding contest. It was Obama who sent the Marines to Northern Australia to confront China, while taking every opportunity to support and protest in the behalf of the new left in China and the democracy movement in Hong Kong. This is an extremely dangerous situation. And in the world that's being created right now, regional nuclear exchanges are almost a certainty in the next generation. A superpower war? Impossible? I'm not sure, that's the case. If you look at the Democratic primary debates in this country, not only did they say nothing about world food security or global poverty or inequality, and I'm talking about, Bernie and Elizabeth Warren, they said nothing about the threat of nuclear weapons and the development of nuclear arsenals. Not a word was said about this. But this is central in the agenda. And finally, I'm sorry for going on so long. Let me just say this, that, what is it now? Almost 175 years ago, a small group of international socialists sat down and wrote a pamphlet, which most people didn't read until it was translated in their languages until years later. And the founders in this pamphlet said something to the effect that the role of communists in the larger workers' movement differs from the mainstream movement really only in two decisive ways. The first is that it represents and struggles of the present, okay, the future, and the future of the movement and the working class. And secondly, it represents in local struggles, national struggles, the interests of the international working class as a whole. And it's so important that this internationalist tradition be kept alive because it's been dramatically missing in the broad new left these days. It's almost as within the ranks of the Sanders campaign and so on, kind of adopted a left-wing version of America Firstism. And I'm very much, and perhaps differ with some people in being a critical supporter of Sanders, but I think we have a real crisis of solidarity and internationalism. This is why, although I had disagreements with the International Socialist Organization, this was what was so catastrophic about its disillusionment, because there's no other organized group consistently internationalist in its activities and in its worldview.
Thank you for those answers. I think if it's okay with the speakers, we have time for one more question. I think this time we'll start with Joseph. So this next question is from Sean in Portland, Oregon, and they ask, in the US, we are now in an economic crisis not seen since the Great Depression, with the unemployment rate at 14% and 20 million jobs lost just in April. What could the role of socialists be in organizing the unemployed, as well as a larger working class response to the crisis? So Joseph, we'll start with you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think on that, it's really important. I mean, the scale of unemployment in the US is astonishing to me. I suspect that by the end of this crisis, there'll be more, the increase in unemployment will be equivalent to the entire British labour force losing their jobs. It's on an absolutely catastrophic scale. I think it's very important that the unions and the left play a role in organising unemployed people where they can, to stop there being divisions within the working class between those who've kept their jobs and those who've lost their jobs. That's something that, you know, we have some experience of organising right to work campaigns and marches of the unemployed and so on over a long periods of time. I think the other question is whether the impact of unemployment means that struggle becomes very, very difficult for people. Clearly, part of the strategy in Britain is now to starve people back into the workplace. I talked about the furlough scheme, whereby the government will pick up 80% of people's wage packets for a period of time. That was really a measure to sort of allow businesses to survive without having to make people redundant, which can be very costly for all kinds of reasons. What they're going to do, I think, over the coming weeks is they're going to gradually scale down that scheme and put people into the kind of situation that a lot of people in America are already in, where essentially they have enough money to feed themselves for 2 or 3 weeks and then nothing, because people live both in America and Britain, I think, largely from paycheck to paycheck, or at least a large section of the labour force does. So this is clearly going to be a factor of trying to use the fear of unemployment to try to undercut struggles and to try to break up the lockdown. And I think we have to politically resist that. And that isn't something that can be left simply to people who are unemployed. It has to involve the mobilization of people in jobs as well. Just another point about the nature of crisis and resistance. The relationship between economic crisis and resistance is a complicated one. For every instance in which a wave of unemployment drives people onto the streets in protest, you can find an instance in which unemployment frightened people into keeping their heads down and trying to hold on to their jobs. The point I want to make about this economic crisis, though, is this isn't going to be something that's gone in a few weeks or months. What we're talking about is a crisis, a multidimensional crisis, whose impact is going to last for decades. I mean, just think about the scale of state spending and what that's going to mean as the pandemic begins to recede, if it does begin to recede. Huge struggles are going to take place over these kind of questions. And even if the working class initially is not moving into activity, is not fighting, is not confident or whatever, as these crises develop, there'll be turning points and there'll be moments which will throw up the possibility of struggles. You look back at the 1930s, it's not true that struggles erupted everywhere all at once. You know, it's 3 or 4 years into the crisis that in countries like France or Spain and elsewhere, you begin to see big upsurges in workers' struggles. So we have to explore the possibilities of struggles where we can, and be a little bit patient and look for opportunities as they arise in this crisis. It's going to be a hard slog. Just finally, to finish, I just want to echo what Mike says, and it's very important that we talk about the importance of internationalism. If you look at the mainstream social democratic left in Britain, there's lots of individuals who are playing a really good role in this crisis. But I was very struck by the new leader of our Labour Party, whose whole approach really is to talk about a shared national interest. And I think one of the things that we have to be extremely critical of is the concept of a shared national interest for 2 reasons. First of all, I have no shared interest with Boris Johnson and the elite in Britain. We have an antagonistic class interest, as Marx pointed out a very long time ago. But secondly, the concept of a national interest completely separates us from this idea that there's something that binds us together with the working class person fighting back in Algeria, Sudan, China, Hong Kong, or wherever it is. And we have to go back, I think, to the basic lessons of international solidarity and socialism from below, which really inspired Marx and Engels and inspired the international socialist tradition of which my organization is part of, and which I think it inspires the thinking behind Marx 21. So just to finish, thank you very much for inviting me. And it's been a very useful and interesting experience to be on this international call tonight.
Well, thank you, Joseph, for speaking. We really appreciate it. And Mike, would you like to respond to the last question?
Let me respond to what Joseph was saying, his last point, then I'll get on to long-term unemployment. Well, here we are in San Diego, and 11 miles from where I sit in my home is our sister city of Tijuana, a manufacturing metropolis of over 2 million people that's become the epicenter of the coronavirus outbreak in Mexico right now. The conditions in the hospitals in Tijuana, they're totally overwhelmed, the hospitals, the clinics. The camps, the kind of squalid camps where the refugees turned back by Trump lived, with sanitation conditions typical of refugee camps anywhere in the world, are now seeing outbreaks that are spreading like lightning. So our internationalist responsibility is right here and right now. I mean, we live in an almost unique urban ecology of 2 cities, which are basically joined at the hip, but divided by the border. And this fully exposes how evil the border is, and how one result of this pandemic has been to increase wall building and further militarization of borders. So the last points made by Joseph are just extremely important, and they fall to us in a very concrete way here in Southern California. I also take from Joseph this idea of a continuing crisis. Now, it's become kind of conventional wisdom amongst particularly college-educated leftists that the left's always predicting the end of capitalism, like in 1918, 1919, or during the Great Depression. But capitalism will always find a way out. Military spending, for instance, rearmament. I wonder if that's really the shape of things to come at all. I don't see any open door. I don't see any model of accumulation that could restore growth in the global economy as a whole. The United States is not going to be able to do it. The European Union, which represents the largest and wealthiest economy in the world, is turned in on itself during this crisis. Not a single country in the EU responded to Italy's request for medical aid. China did. And China, while winning some soft power because it's the only country that's been willing to respond, along with heroic Cuba, as always, the only country willing to respond, particularly in the poor countries, but also in Europe itself, can't lead the way or provide the growth engine to restart the global economy. I mean, we are in a crisis that possibly has no solution and will, as it continues, accrete to itself more and more crisis, more and more threats to survival, particularly the poorest people in the world. And finally, about unemployment in this country. Sure, I think we should support Bernie Sanders' idea of $2,000 a month for everybody. Makes sense. It's an ordinary New Deal type reform, let's support. But we have to go way beyond that. We have to understand the private sector will never generate the jobs that people need to return to. It has to come from the public sector. That if we look around us, we find a kind of strange situation where people are plunged back into literal misery and increasingly hunger in this country. But we're surrounded by most enormous wealth. We should reduce the working day. The coming months will be a very important opportunity to start talking about the 30 or the 35-hour week in this country, about public creation of employment, and not just makeshift jobs repairing holes in the pavement or rebuilding physical infrastructure, because we're going to have a huge number of junior college and state college graduates in this country who basically have had the future stolen from them. Public employment that educates and puts people where they're most needed, including in healthcare and in the caring professions in general, and turning minimum wage jobs into good jobs. This is an enormous area of debate, and we would be very much in error if we are anything less than audacious, because people are ready for, particularly of your generation, are ready for audacious solutions.
Thank you. Thank you again to the speakers for taking the time out of your really busy schedules. I know it's been a really busy time for you, so we appreciate you coming today and taking this time to speak with us about these really important issues. And thank you everyone for attending and participating in this panel presentation. If you're interested in what you heard here today, if you like what you heard here today, please consider joining March 21. You can visit our website and fill out this Google form that's getting dropped in the Facebook chat now to stay in contact with us. If you're interested in learning more generally about Marxism and about our politics, we'll be holding a reading group starting next Sunday discussing Chris Harman's How Marxism Works. And really, we have national branch meetings and meetings where we can get more into discussion. I know this was more of a presentation, but we want to be discussing with you and sharing questions and thoughts and ideas alongside practicing struggle out in the streets. In addition, we have our members in Southern California, like Mike said, are involved in this Alliance to Defend Immigrants, which is hosting a meeting next Tuesday at 5 p.m. about fighting for immigrant rights today. Very important meeting that's going to happen. And that link for that is dropped in the Facebook live stream now as well. We are also planning more of these international panel discussions with inspiring speakers. So please sign up for more information. Stay tuned for more. So with that, I'd like to thank the speakers again. Thank all of you for attending, and I hope I get to see and meet you soon. Thank you.
Thank you, and a shout out to all my comrades in the SWP and the British Isles.
Thanks, Mike.
Thanks.